about temporal lobe seizures in Chapter 9 of Dr. V.S. Ramachandran's Phantoms in the Brain, and how they relate to out-of-body experiences, which is a personal favorite topic of mine for a very long time, since I was watching the X-Files, actually, as a little kid. Well, as you remember, we've learned that temporal lobe seizures include certain experiences that seem divine or involve images of divine, angel-type entities, a rapturous union with all things. This happens across all cultures, all religions. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and I would say it's more benign than most neurologic conditions because it transmits this feeling of happiness and oneness. It's definitely been localized recently to temporal lobe dysfunction. If you're unfamiliar with out-of-body experiences, it's what's also known as astral voyaging. People fall into a trance while they're asleep or they're partially dreaming. It could be a light trance state. It's also correlated with sleep paralysis as well. But people will float out of their body and experience their house while asleep and look back and see themselves. It's a very, very strange phenomenon. It's a very ancient phenomenon. It was actually documented by Herodotus, who's called the father of history, so there's some weight there. He said that there was a man named Aristu who hit his head against a rock when falling, and he was dead. And he was being buried 2-3 days later. He came to and described how he was out of his body and experiencing a different life, walking around, and was aware of his body elsewhere for 2 or 3 days. There's another incident of a philosopher who would voluntarily induce these out-of-body trances, would voyage around his countryside, but he told his wife to guard his body against his enemies when he was away, and she slipped up one time and they found the body and burned it. That's something I read when I was a kid. I couldn't find that again online. So out-of-body experiences are a very, very odd phenomenon. I mentioned the X-Files earlier. They're kind of a new agey thing. I remember as a kid in the 90s, they were very, very voguey. But they're a very ancient phenomenon. A person experiences the feeling of drifting out of her body. You can look back and see the body, and the disembodied self can move around the room, or the neighborhood, or the entire planet. There's accounts of people who go to other planets and they see other galaxies, they see the Horsehead Nebula. It's very, very mystical, what have you. So they return sometimes later, they get pulled back by this silver cord. It's like a tether, and like I said, this is kind of a sleep paralysis type thing for most. So a concept you might not be familiar with is that this is possible as far as a teaching tool to be transmitted to anybody else. There are people who actually have workshops and published books about how to learn astral voyaging. And how would this work? Well, the first person to ever do this, to teach people to induce this condition that I found, was a man named Robert Monroe. He had a long career as a researcher once he learned to induce these things. He used a strange kind of audio recording he pioneered to stimulate his temporal lobes, we now know. And he regularly departed his body. He regularly left his body for hours at a time, and he would come back and talk to his wife about living in another body elsewhere in the universe, different world, different planet, having a family and a whole life there. He wrote books, he went on talk shows about this. There's a man more contemporary to us in Australia named Robert Bruce who has a large publishing empire, and he trains people through contemplation exercises to be aware of a vibrating point, a moving point of vibration that moves up and down their body. And as they learn to be aware of this, the entire body can vibrate and they can climb up and out of their body, or they can float out of their body, or they can roll out of their body while half asleep. And we can't really dismiss this as just shrewd entrepreneurial hokum, what have you. There's a lot of research in neuroplasticity that confirms meditation works. It does reshape the brain. It does develop parietal lobe. You can see this in data from studies monks have contributed to, Tibetan monks. So these gurus and their techniques should be learnable over time. Strangely enough, they do correlate, like most of the scientific studies, with sleep paralysis, the out-of-body training. A research study in 2004 I referenced, though, Professor Blank et al., stated that systematic neurological studies of out-of-body experiences and autoscopic, seeing oneself while being outside oneself, these are extremely rare, and to date, no testable neuroscientific theory exists. 2004. Yet Blank and Arzi the next year report that this folk psychology claim of spatial unity of self and body, the soul, that it's actually caused by a failure to integrate multisensory information at the temporal-parietal junction, tying it to what we know about the strange religious experiences, the visions, the beings, the feeling of otherness from temporal seizures. So Blank and Arzi say the temporal-parietal junction, sensory disintegration, leads to the disruption of several phenomenological and cognitive aspects of self-processing, causing illusory reduplication, illusory self-location, illusory perspective, illusory agency. They've pretty much attributed this completely to a temporal-parietal junction failure to integrate multisensory information. 2009, 4 years later, a study by Chain and Girard report that when they stimulated through TMS the vestibular cortex, the balance area of the brain, they reported virtually identical out-of-body self-hallucinations in their subjects. They furthermore went to do some self-report data, 2 online surveys, and those results complemented their theory completely. The neurophysiological evidence of transcranial magnetic stimulation on the vestibular lobe, that theory was totally consistent with the reports of out-of-body experiences through the self-report data and the experiences of, as we now can tie it back to, the vibrations that Robert Bruce talks about. So the parietal lobe, as we have talked about, comprises body map, spatial placement in the world, our 3D comprehension of the world. The temporal lobe, as we now understand, does recognition of objects. It does sensory processing, especially auditory sensory processing. The fact that Robert Monroe could program some strange binaural audio program and stimulate temporal lobes, inducing this experience, makes some sense. And the fact that Robert Bruce could have a moving somatosensory vibration meditation, build up some kind of vestibular trance state, that also makes a lot of sense. So clearly this is a condition that's real and controllable with practice. And it does impart some value to those who experience it. So it's not really a voyage to other rooms of the house or other planets. It's a temporal-parietal dysfunction and or a vestibular effect that is learnable, apparently. Balance, body position, body mapping dysfunction. Also, though, a recognition dysfunction. This is actually reminding me of Capgras syndrome, where the person loses their sense of familiarity. They cannot remember how to feel towards their family, their friends, so their family and friends feel like zombies or robots. They have a wild paranoid distrust. That's a bad kind of dysfunction recognition-wise. This is not so bad. This is somewhat religious for some people. It's a very mystical kind of situation for people. And it sounds also like near-death experiences, which are broadly similar to out-of-body experiences, and have also, in research, been correlated with temporal lobe dysfunction. This is visions of heavenly beings or tunnels of light when people are declared dead physically and they come back. So in closing, out-of-body experiences are tied to temporal lobe dysfunction, or at least seizure activity. They're also tied to a temporal-parietal relationship and possibly a vestibular relationship with the balance effects, the rolling out of the body, the weird vibrations. And the anecdotes of astral voyaging to other places cannot be totally dismissed. There was military research into remote viewing, for example. So this is still a somewhat mysterious topic despite all of the neuroplasticity we understand and all the localization and function we now understand about the brain. I hope you've enjoyed this small lecture on out-of-body experiences. Thanks very much for watching.